I think we'll move on to our next speaker, if that's okay with you. So I'm delighted to introduce Raymond Frogner now from the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation, who's joining us from Canada. The National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation is devoted to the study of the history and legacy of the Canadian residential school programme. And in 2020, the NCTR won a $6 million Canadian Foundation for Innovation grants to help develop a digital preservation programme for over 4 million digital documents and 7,000 recordings of Indigenous testimonies of the history and legacy of the residential school programme. So I'm not going to give away the punchline. I won't take away the details from you, Raymond, but you're going to tell us now about that digital preservation programme and where you ended up. So I'll hand over to you.
Great. Tanse, Raymond Netigason, Notari Oscar, Egua, Nigari Doris, Nentatoscan, National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. Bonjour, je m'appelle Raymond, je suis le directeur des archives pour le Centre National pour la Vérité et la Réconciliation. I'm speaking to you today from the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and the homelands of the Métis peoples. We respect the treaties that were signed on these territories and move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and respect. If I can just upload my speaking notes here. So I think everyone can now see that screen.
No, not yet.
Oh,
that's it.
Okay, there we go. So, as Sarah's mentioned, we did receive a CFI grant. So I'll begin with just a bit of context of the National Centre and the work that was done preceding the grant and the challenge that we were presented with and why we chose this grant and the solution we found with the digitization project that we applied. So just to give a bit of context, the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement was created to put an end to more than 4,000 lawsuits involving more than 10,000 plaintiffs who are suing Canada and the Christian churches that operate the Indian residential schools. The IRSA did not invent the idea of creating a national research center. Before there was a TRC, there was a Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1997, which also recommended the establishment of a National Indigenous Research Center. So this had been discussed since the 70s. The original mandate of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and to put this into context, there were a large spate of international Truth and Reconciliation Commissions happening at this time. So this wasn't a completely unique idea in a Canadian context. The colonial aspect, the history and legacy with Indigenous peoples, did give it a unique kind of flavor. But the Schedule N of the original TRC mandate, which came out of the IRSA, mandated the center with several functions: acknowledge residential school experiences, impacts, and consequences; provide a holistic, culturally appropriate, and safe setting for former students and their families and communities as they came forward to the commission; witness, support, promote, and facilitate truth and reconciliation events; promote awareness and public education of Canadians about the Indian residential school system and its impacts; identify sources and create as complete an historical record as possible of the IRS system and legacy. So that essentially was the mandate of the commission as it started in 2007. And just an important detail to note, this was not a judicial commission. It did not have the power of subpoena. It could not produce an injunction to appear in court or before a tribunal. This in spite of the fact that it was well recognized that there were several thousand human rights abuses committed against children at these schools. But the goal of the commission was to document the lived experiences of survivors at residential schools, what was known as a victim-centered or truth-seeking commission. And the commission relied on the voluntary offering of the statements of survivors to begin a process of healing, reconciliation, and revitalization. Now, having said all that, the records that we did acquire, preserve, and make available under the IRSA, the deal that was struck was between governments, federal and provincial, Christian authorities representing various Christian groups that ran the churches, and representatives of Indigenous peoples. As part of the agreement, it was stated that the perpetrators of these crimes shall not be released, the names of the perpetrators of these crimes. However, having said that, nothing is stopping a researcher once they come to us and get the redacted records to go forward and pursue their research, and if they should so choose to to take someone to court based on the records that they found, that's completely up to them. So part of the problem with this record, with this project, was that there was a very unclear archival mandate. The IRSA required an archive, but it never explained the archival process that was required. It did not clarify the vital questions of archival process, such as acquisition, discovery, reference and access, storage and preservation. And this is endemic across international commissions around the world. I just spoke to the ICA 2 days ago about another set of commissions that are happening in Africa. We've had a guest visit us from the Côte d'Ivoire, as well as Ghana. We've been in discussion with representatives from Argentina, New Zealand, Australia, and the common comment is that there's very rarely an archival component to the Truth Commission's process. So once these investigations have occurred, how are they made accessible? How are they preserved and passed on to future generations? And as I just said before, the only direct instructions for creating and maintaining an archive in the entire IRSA really was to identify the sources and create the most complete historical record possible on the residential school system. And just to expand on that just a little bit further, in international arenas, there have been some statements regarding, in particular, rights of Indigenous people, the collective rights of Indigenous people, beginning since the 70s, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People required 25 years of campaigning on the part of Indigenous peoples around the world to get the UN to pass that document. However, in the 46 articles of the UNDRIP, never once is the word archive used. Social memory is very rarely referenced. It's a high-level document on the principles of the rights, the collective rights of Indigenous peoples. So in many of these cases that we see the recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples, but the evidence that is used to revitalize these communities, to pass on to future generations, to give them the recognition of their cultural identities, that seems to be, the process of that seems to be missing in a lot of cases. We're filled with principles, but we don't have many working model examples. And this also begins in the literature as well. In political science and philosophy, there have been what's been talked about as an archival turn in philosophy. Foucault, Derrida, Said, the names are quite familiar, and they again make reference to, systemic racism of colonial programs. But again, there's very rarely any sort of discussion of the idea of process. And of course, being archives is always 15 to 20 years behind the latest philosophical ideas and concepts. So, we sort of caught up to this after a fashion in one sense. So one of the principal difficulties that the TRC had was that the sources were so dispersed. The commission visited over 104 church repositories, and these are just a few examples of them, and 47 sets of government records, both provincial and federal, to start to create a portal or a hub, a national research center, because never before had the story of the residential school program ever been pulled together in one coherent resource base. So this was a unique effort on the part of the TRC to do this, and in the 7 years that they were given as a mandate, by 2015, when they finished their work, they still had a lot of work to do. And so that is the work that we picked up on, and we're still collecting records. Just this week, I received another 2,000 files from the Order of the Oblate Order, Mary Immaculate. So our work continues to acquire records. We're still taking testimonies as well. So this is an ongoing project. But we now have a preservation program, which I'm getting to, so I promise, very soon. Another part of the problem, in addition to the dispersal of sources by location, or by authorities, was the dispersal of sources by location. This is just a sample for the Oblate records. The Oblates were responsible for overseeing the operations of 49 of the 140 residential schools that were recognized in the settlement agreement. The Catholic Church in general ran over 60% of the schools, particularly in Western Canada. But the records that are kept by the oblates, this is just one example. There's well over 10, approaching maybe 15 different repositories that hold oblate records in Western Canada. And we've been striking agreements and pulling in records from all of those various places. This includes maps, architectural plans, operational and administrative files, photographs of the schools. So this is the documentary history, the documentary heritage of the residential school program, which is fundamental and has to be pulled together in order to study it, to interrogate oppression, as we say sometimes here. But the other side of it was the legacy, and the legacy consisted of consulting with communities, talking with intergenerational survivors of the downstream legacy of the trauma of residential schools and how it's impacted these communities. So to do that, the TRC visited over 200 communities across the country in 7 years to hold what was called sharing circles and sharing panels. And in addition to that, it's another part of the IRSA. There was something called an independent assessment process. So for the most egregious crimes that occurred at these schools, there was a legal process where a survivor could, with a lawyer, sit down and give an interview to a panel, a tribunal, and at the end of the tribunal, they would be awarded a sum of money, which was a very difficult situation to begin with. But those were private investigations, and we are still in the process of trying to argue for their preservation. The Supreme Court has stated that if survivors did not give their opinion on the final disposition of these testimonies during the tribunal, they have until 2027 to state their decision, and by then, if there's no decision given, the records will be destroyed. So we're doing everything we can in court at this moment to try and rescue those, what amounts to actually 38,000 testimonies. And the clock is ticking, we realize that, and to change the Supreme Court decision is to move heaven and earth. So it's still up in the air whether or not we can preserve those testimonies. However, at the end of its work, the TRC had recorded for public consumption 7,000 testimonies of survivors. That amounted to 3,639 private statements, 1,174 sharing circles, as they're called, or sharing panels. These were group events that were recorded on various formats of audiovisual equipment. The total number of AV files ended up being 44,805. Total AV size was just over 106 terabytes. By duration, it was just over 2,500 hours of recordings. And when combined with the photographs, the maps, and the other documents that were collected, there's a total size of all digital files of almost 250 terabytes. So part of the CFI grant was to set up a new server system that would be able to house and store for long-term preservation purposes all of this digital material. And we did that by striking an agreement with the NFB, the National Film Board of Canada, who has by far the most experience in producing documentaries as well as preserving them and making them available online. So as part of the CFI grant, we struck an agreement for almost $2 million with the NFB to implement a digital preservation program for all of the 7,000 recordings, which I just mentioned. I should point out, just for detail and to make it clear, the CFI is actually a science-oriented grant. So one of the first things we had to do was convince the CFI committee that creating a decolonizing archive would actually be part of their mandate, be part of the grant, the way they would administer the grant and the objectives of the grant. So first we had to explain research infrastructure and how it fit in. And just to point out, we did get the grant, and we were the first in the history of Manitoba, the University of Manitoba, we were the first non-science office to actually get awarded a CFI grant. Normally, as I say here, it includes the state-of-the-art equipment, laboratories, databases, specimens, scientific collections, etc. So we very much focus on this idea of databases and the IT infrastructure that would be required to preserve and make available these testimonies, and that's how we spun our application. So what we said was this project implements digital architecture. It enables advanced discovery and access of digital archival records to promote innovative research meaningful to Indigenous communities. It uniquely provides researchers materials to theorize oppression and disrupt the colonial relationships between academic researchers and Indigenous communities. So that's the decolonizing approach that we try to make it understandable to the CFI judges. And then we try to place innovative research into this kind of residential school experience. And as we put in the grant, access to the NCTR archives is a public good. This proposed infrastructure will enable vital digital projects to identify children lost at residential schools, to discover the locations of unmarked children's grave sites, to create a statistical analysis of the health and welfare of residential school survivors, to design collaborative and innovative health and education programs with Indigenous communities. This digital infrastructure promotes reconciliation through acknowledgement. It is a recognition that we are what we choose to remember, but we're also what we choose to forget. And so finally, just to make it clear, and I'll make this as my last boring slide before I show some of the recordings. We tried to explain to the committee exactly what did we mean by a decolonizing archive, because as I said, it's been talked about in a lot of different venues, in a lot of academic circles as well, especially since the 70s, but it's never really been implemented. So I just put together 6 points in the application to expand on what we mean by creating a decolonizing archive. It recognizes the embedded colonizing role played by traditional colonial archives. It acknowledges the overlapping multiplicity of rights, provenance, and the diverse meanings embodied in archival documents. It recognizes that archival evidence is not a fact, it is a matrix of relationships. And like all relationships, it's vulnerable to trust and mistrust, good faith and manipulation. It's a living archive, a place of gathering and participation. It does not preserve static records frozen in time, but recognizes their dynamic, evolving, intergenerational meaning for communities and individuals. It provides a social memory infrastructure that supports Indigenous cognitive practices, Indigenous knowledge methods, and social protocols. It breaks out of the textual paradigm of archival evidence. It will build on the digital potential to interrelate diverse genres of social memory to create a holistic center of social memory, recognizing the spiritual and environmental in the context of local sanction. And finally, it'll offer a safe and accessible space for Indigenous peoples to learn of and freely express their views on the legacy of the residential school experience, and for settler society to encounter, acknowledge, and reconcile. So working with, let me just see here, I'll pull this up now. Working with the materials that the TRC provided or created, let me just see if I get this. I think you can see the website, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the challenges we had working with what the TRC created was the enormous diversity of formats. It was an incredibly large set of different formats. And basically the way it worked was the TRC would put out an announcement weeks in advance to a community, and they would ask for someone to set up recording of this event. So the lighting, the sound, everything was different by event. So one of our biggest challenges was to try to put together the best quality final version of the recordings that we could put together. And for that, we did lean very heavily on the expertise of the NFB and their documentary specialists and their engineers. I can't get into the IT specialization of how they did it. We do have a published document, a technical document from the NFB on what they did and their concerns, and I can make that available to anyone who wants to view that. But making what we call a master copy of each sharing panel and sharing circle was our ultimate goal. So the first thing we did was we sent the NFB an enormous amount of samples, because the other problem that we had, in addition to the quality of the sound and the visuals, was also that there was an enormous amount of B-roll that was mixed in with the recordings, outtakes from other cameras, sounds, etc. So we also shared that with them to get some advice on the best way to preserve that as well. And in the end, they came back with a few recommendations for very high-end and very space eating kind of recommendations. We landed eventually on JPEG-2000 as the preservation format that would be used, and that the NFV would transpose and fix any quality control for sound and color in that master copy, which would then be transferred back to us, stored in our servers in what we call the vault, which is not accessible. It's only accessible to a few of the staff at our institution. They would also make 2 other copies, what they call the mezzanine copy, which would be a high quality copy for researchers and media, and then a lower res quality for access on the website. So that was their approach to that. And as for the B-roll, we decided that we're using a preservation program called Archivematica, which was out of Vancouver. A company called Artifactual makes it. And what they do is they create what's called an archival information package using the ISO model. So we're taking each sharing panel and putting all the B-roll through Archivematica and storing it as MP4s in the vault as a AIP, separate from the master copy of the sharing circle or sharing panel, which is also linked to, which will both link together so that you can search them all. So that was kind of the solution that they added, and we're about, I would say, 3/4 of the way through that now. And I'll just give you a couple examples of some of the testimonies that were recorded, and just to give you an idea of just what was actually being worked on. So this is the archives portion of our webpage. We can go to events, and that'll take you to all of the recordings by hearing. And just to give you an example of one of the things that was challenging for us. So this is an overview of the hearing in Aklavik, which is very far north in the Arctic and Northwest Territories. So this is a profile of it. And then you can go to the hearing here. And as you can see in this case, it goes straight into the testimony. Now let me just make sure. I think, did I remember to? Yes, I did. Sound share is on. So I'll just give you a very brief example.
Well, thank you, Joe. It's always we're always obligated to speak our.
That might be very faint. So
Well, we always feel comfortable when we do speak our own Aboriginal language of the land. Certainly like to welcome the Truth and Reconciliations Commissioner.
So I'll just stop it. It's pretty faint, and I think we could play the sound and make it better. But the point I want to make with this is, you notice it's 7 hours, and so for a viewer, this is very onerous, and it's also not very informative if someone is looking for a particular statement. So what we're doing at the moment is we actually have, just due to cost, we have one poor AV editor going through these sharing panels and sharing circles and indexing them by speaker. So to give you a better example, then I'll go to, let's just see here. So Alex Janvier is an Indigenous artist of national status. He's also a residential school survivor. And as you can see here in this sharing circle, which is part of the Alberta national event, that's what the ABNE stands for. In this sharing circle, they have been edited and broken down by speaker. So you can find the speakers, and ultimately we will have this done. It's one person working on this, and have been working on it for several years. And we continue to upload the new edited versions, but I'll give you just to give you an idea, Alex Janvier's work is very prominent in the National Gallery in Ottawa. It's also displayed in the House of Commons. So he's an Indigenous artist of international status. And this is his testimony.
Hello. That's in English, of course.
I'm a survivor. Last week we went to the gathering in Blue Quills. That's the school that deranged my life. That's the Catholics, of course, you know. I heard the Protestants did a little different.
But the other one is going around.
But when you hear Andy Jackson from the Protestant side, he's got some good stories too, you know. How almost equally we were treated. I'm a professional artist today. I live by it. I've raised 6 children on my own with my wife. I've never asked government for a penny. And I think I'll just ask for the country back, never mind the pennies. And I believe that. I teach my grandchildren and children to believe that they're the landlords.
So it goes on for 8 more minutes. I would encourage everyone to have a look. It's one of the more impactful ones. I've deliberately avoided the really difficult recordings and testimonies simply because it's slightly exploitive, and I don't think it's necessary for this venue. But if you start scrolling through them, you'll see at the top of this website there is a crisis line. We're probably the only archive in the country that actually has health support for researchers that are working with our records, just because of this content. And I'll give you one last example. Oops. Try it again. So this, just to give you an example, this is a sharing panel in Red Deer, which is in the province of Alberta. And again, as you can see, this one has been broken up by speaker. I have chosen Brenda Reynolds for the simple reason that she was actually the director of health support for the TRC when they were making these visits to various communities.
Our
Again,
next
you can see
presenter
there's
is
a
going to
variety
be
of
Brenda Reynolds.
quality. There's the Honorable Murray Sinclair, who was the director of the TRC at the time.
Brenda, you have your team behind you? Good. Whenever you're ready.
Thanks. Good afternoon. My name is Brenda Reynolds, and I'm Anishinaabe Kwe from Saskatchewan. I grew up on a reserve in Saskatchewan. And today I want to talk about my own personal experience of how my whole life was impacted by Indian residential school, and how the silence of that whole experience had impacted me right from conception, and how it wasn't a welcomed beginning because of the conception that was experienced right in the very beginning. And my very early years before I started school, my life was really good. It was really, really good. I hung around with my dad, and I was with my grandfather, and they were both my.
So as you can see, the quality is mixed in the way that everything was shot and recorded. They were just local videographers, not just, but they were local videographers. So there's quite literally over 10 different formats of AV that were used. As again, I said, the sound quality was also difficult. So the NFB did a lot of work with us, selecting the master copies, selecting out the B-roll, and then making the master copies as rendering them as well as possible, so that we have a master version of all 7,000 testimonies now. And we can say with certainty that they are in JPEG 2000 formats, and we're about, I'd say, 2/3 of the way through the process. We continue to transfer batches over to the NFB, and actually just yesterday Jimmy Fournier flew out from Montreal. He probably flew out, his timing was probably pretty bad because it was actually almost -40 here yesterday. It's much warmer today. But he came out yesterday and we spent a day reviewing what's been happening. Some of the issues that have come up is just making sure that we are selecting what is B-roll and how to make sure that we have the best master copies of these recordings. And in addition, we're working with the NFB to have 2 geolocated tape copies of the master versions at the NFB, both running off of different systems. So that if one system goes down, the other still remains. The other, they're actually what Jimmy refers to as cold storage, meaning that if they do have an attack online, which they have had as a national institution, it's not uncommon. None of the materials that they kept on tape in their cold storage system were touched. So we have our master copies of these testimonies on 2 different tapes in 2 different systems at the NFB in Montreal. So they're geolocated in a different location for preservation purposes, as well as our vault version that we have on the system array that we purchased for this project. Going forward, as I've said, indexing is clearly an issue. And one of the things that we'd like to do, if I could just give you one brief example of what we're thinking, is that we can go to schools, for example. So if somebody in a testimony talks about a school, it is possible to go to the school and then get a profile of the school and all of the records. In this case, it's just a sample. We have thousands more. But when a person in the video talks about an event, it should be possible to, in a relational database that we do have, to link to the items that might document what they're talking about in their testimony, which would make a much more interesting and useful matrix of evidence of the past experiences and the contemporary legacies of these events. So we're looking at working with the NFB to try and design some kind of browser. At the moment, it just depends on the default media player that you use in your browser, and that's what plays these recordings. What we'd like to have, and the NFB does have one, and we're working to develop one even more sophisticated, is a browser that would be indexed that would allow us to index by subject. I mean, all of these testimonies have already been transcribed, so it would be possible in the transcriptions to highlight subject terms. We have a list of subject terms that we are indexing our records by, so it would be possible to index the testimonies using those transcripts and then link them over to these records that we have on the schools themselves. So pulling together the testimonies and the documents, as I just said. So that's pretty much in a rapid fire nutshell where we are. As I said, we're about 2/3 of the way through preserving everything with the NFB. We have another, actually we have 2 years left in our CFI grant, so we're slightly ahead of schedule. So we're doing pretty well that way.
Wonderful. I was going to ask, in fact, about the grant funding and whether your sort of aspirations for indexing and things were covered by that, but you're making good progress, so that's excellent. It sounds like you've got still a lot to do. It's a mammoth task, but you're doing it. Well done. Yeah. So congratulations on the work that you've done so far, on your award. Can I invite everybody just to join me in a round of applause for Raymond and the work of the NCTR. I think it's tremendous stuff, it really is. Nancy's had to leave us for another appointment, but before she left, popped a message in the chat box for you, Raymond, saying your work is so important. I've been following along with great interest, working at the Open Society Archives and on projects for UNHCR. I've intersected with and appreciated the effort involved in truth and reconciliation work. Your project is a model for others. She says, I'm sorry, I need to hop off at the hour, so I'll miss the next Q&A period, but congratulations for being recognised for your significant projects. And that's, I guess, to you and to Sasha as well. So congratulations both. We've got a few moments just more for questions, if anybody has anything they'd like to ask Raymond, particularly about the work at the NCTR.
I have a couple of questions, but I don't want to take the spotlight from anyone else in case.
Well, go for it, Sharon, and others can think about what they'd like to ask while you're talking.
Oh, now I don't know which of my two questions I want to ask them both. Uh, Actually, I'll go for, so one of the things that we're about to start working on at the GPC is some work around mental health and well-being for people working in digital preservation specifically, but archiving more generally. And I just wonder, how has that been handled in terms of the staff that have been working on the project? Because obviously this is an incredibly important work, but I can imagine that the content can be quite traumatizing at times. So have you kind of built that into the project structure?
Very much so. That's a really good question. As you can see on the website, on every page, we have that contact crisis line. If anyone wants to talk to a health support worker, one of the reasons I gave Brenda Reynolds example is she was the lead of the health support for the project. But we have 2 spiritual guides here at the center that give us talks every week. And at any time they're available for discussion. But you're right, the original editor of these recordings has actually quit because he found it too difficult. And we try to give the editor other work as much as possible, just so that it's not a constant review of these testimonies, because it does grind you down. It's really hard. So yeah, we have our health support here all the time. So, you know, whenever it's possible, we have these discussions. And as I said, we have weekly meetings to go over these things.
More comments and support for your work in the chat box there, Raymond. Jen says, such an important project and good to hear that the archives are in safe hands. And Michael Popham, our colleague from the DPC, also asks, is there anything, oh, the chat's just moved, is there anything you would have done differently knowing what you know now?
And this is the advice I say to TRCs in general, is that at the start of a TRC, there necessarily has to be a preservation program in place. It was I wouldn't say chaos, but it was really difficult to just hire local videographers to record these events, because by community, sometimes they were excellent, sometimes they were almost hard to use. So if we could just, and this is what's happening now with the unmarked burial sites that have been discovered since 2021. We're trying to get ahead of the investigations and supply communities and investigators with a uniform set of instructions for creating and storing and preserving the materials that they're creating. So we actually do have a set of digital repositories communities can use for free, so that they can store all their material as they're doing their research. They don't have to worry about, you know, IT support or managing servers or systems administration or anything like that. They can just store their materials in these repositories that we've created for them. And we recognize that this could go on for 5 or 10 years of investigation. It's a deal that we struck with Microsoft. I know a lot of people are saying, why Microsoft? But we were able to strike this deal as an educational project, so we got it for free. And it was also using OneDrive model, ready to go almost. We looked at the cost and the infrastructure that would be required to set up our own repositories, and based on the fact that many of these communities are already going forward with their research, we needed to act quickly, and we could put these repositories up. They're operating at the moment. So that's another way that we're helping make the management of the data that's created more uniform and more available for future generations by preserving it in a consistent manner.
Good question, Sharon. It came up, sorry, Michael. Good question, Michael. Sasha also chiming in with support for you, Raymond, there. They say this looks like an incredible model that could be informative to many different areas of archival practice. They'll be sharing your site with colleagues who are interested in decolonial strategies in our work. So we're seeing that happening with our colleagues in Australia as well, who are working in the similar sphere. So lots of sort of lessons learned and knowledge to be shared. And as Sasha says, an incredible model and incredible work. So thank you for sharing it with us. Thank you for coming along today. Congratulations on your recognition, I think, but well deserved. It seems that we've sort of come to a close, but if you do have any more questions for Sasha or for Raymond, and you'd like to just pop them through to us, we can certainly pass those on. I'm sure you won't mind, both of you, if we kind of put people in touch with you.
Yeah,
Thumbs up,
sure.
great stuff.